They were never supposed to open it. Not in 1907, not ever. But when the frost lifted that March, and the floodwaters dragged half the cemetery's hillside into the Blackwood River, the founder's tomb cracked open for the first time in nearly a century. The local men who went down there didn't speak of what they saw. Not in public, not even to their wives. One of them, Jonas Harrow, slit his own throat less than a week later. Another, Elijah Kearns, took the train west that same night and never came back. Before we start this story, please like and subscribe to my channel and don't forget to press the bell icon. You have to understand, this wasn't just a coffin. This was Thomas Blackwood's resting place, the man who carved Blackwood Falls out of the Vermont wilderness with iron, gunpowder, and blood. A man whose fortune built every church, every school, every brick of the town square, but who vanished from public life 20 years before his death, sealing himself inside his estate like a prisoner, taking meetings only at night, and insisting that when he finally died, he be buried beneath the town itself, in a vault he designed with no windows, no stairs, and no record of its true depth. The air inside was wrong, damp, but not with rot, heavy, metallic, almost electric, as if the crypt itself were a lung breathing on its own. The torchlight caught on walls carved not with scripture or family crests, but with symbols that no one in Blackwood Falls had ever seen before. Curves and spirals that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. And then there was the coffin. Black iron, not wood. Bolted shut, not nailed. Etched in the same twisting symbols, each one inlaid with something that shimmered red under the torchlight. It took 4 men to unseal it, and when they did, they found him. Thomas Blackwood had not decayed, not at all. His skin was pale, his lips drawn back in something between a smile and a warning, and in his folded hands rested a book bound in something that was not leather, with pages so thin they were almost translucent. That book has never been found, not officially, but I can tell you, its words have shaped this town in ways you were never meant to understand. The town council claimed they resealed the crypt that night, but I've seen the original clerk's ledger, and the signatures don't match. For 3 days after the flood, the vault was left unguarded, no record of who went in or out, no accounting of what might have been taken. What we do know is that when the stone was finally rolled back into place, the bolts driven home and the hill regraded to hide the scar, 5 of the men who'd been seen on the cemetery grounds simply vanished from the census. No bodies, no graves, no forwarding addresses, just gone as if Blackwood Falls itself had swallowed them. And in the weeks that followed, something began to move through the town. Not a person, not an animal. Something colder, quieter, the kind of presence you don't see so much as feel in the marrow of your bones. Doors began unlocking themselves at night. Chimneys exhaled smoke when no fire was lit. People woke with strange patterns pressed into their skin, spirals and hooks like the symbols from the crypt, as if they'd been branded in their sleep. And then the dreams came, the same dream shared by dozens of people who'd never spoken to each other. A black chamber underground, a book that could not be read without bleeding, and a voice that said, "He's not done building." Most dismissed it as hysteria, but the old records suggest otherwise, that this was the same dream that plagued the workers who built the vault back in 1821. And those workers, too, were never the same. You might think this is just small-town superstition, a string of bad dreams and bad luck stitched together by gossip, but I've seen the records, and the patterns are too precise to ignore. Every 33 years, something happens here in Blackwood Falls that no one can explain, no one can stop, and no one can talk about without feeling that same deep, crawling unease. It happened in 1840, when the town's first mayor went missing after being seen walking toward the cemetery in the middle of the night. It happened in 1873, when the schoolhouse burned to the ground with all 8 of its pupils inside, their bodies never recovered, their names struck from the town's rolls as if they'd never existed. And in 1907, the year the crypt opened, it began again. But this time, the signs were different. People started finding small black stones in their homes, each one carved with a fragment of those same shifting symbols. Livestock were found dead, their bodies arranged in perfect circles, eyes wide open, mouths stretched into silent screams. Even the river seemed to change, running slower, thicker, as though carrying something heavier than water. The town council passed new rules. No one was to go near the old cemetery after dark, no mention of Thomas Blackwood in public meetings, and above all, no one was to speak of the book. They never explained why. But in the private diaries of 2 council members who later died mysteriously, there's a single recurring phrase, written over and over like a prayer or a ward against something they feared would hear them. Do not turn the last page. The vault was never a simple grave. It was a machine, buried beneath the skin of the town like a hidden organ, pulsing in time with something older than Vermont itself. I found the original quarry records in a locked cabinet in the county hall, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from rot, but the pages were brittle and blackened around the edges, as if they'd been burned in secret before someone changed their mind about destroying them entirely. They detail shipments of stone, not from the local quarries, but from a site over 200 miles away in the White Mountains, a site that was abandoned the very month construction ended. The laborers, 31 men in all, were paid double wages, in gold, and required to sign a pledge swearing they would never speak of their work. Some of those signatures are shaky, blotted with what might have been sweat or blood. The plans for the vault are unlike anything I've seen in any architectural archive, a main chamber with no structural necessity for the spiraled carvings that line every surface, a floor built of alternating layers of granite and iron plate, and in the center, a hexagonal platform sunk just deep enough to hold the coffin. The walls are thick, too thick, and behind them run narrow channels filled with some kind of hardened resin, black and glossy, smelling faintly of iron. The documents refer to these channels as veins, and there, in the builder's own notes, one line is underlined 3 times. The veins must be sealed before the occupant is placed, or the exchange begins too soon. No one ever explains what the exchange is, but in the margin, someone has scrawled, in a hand that is not the builder's, "It can't be stopped once he starts breathing." Thomas Blackwood's body didn't resist decay by chance. It was the result of something deliberate, something that began long before the coffin was sealed. The deeper I dug into the records, the more a single disturbing thread emerged. In the final year of his life, Blackwood dismissed almost all of his household staff, keeping only 2 men, both former quarry workers from the vault site, as his constant attendants. They lived in the mansion, never seen in town, and when they did appear in public, it was always together, silent, their eyes glazed like sleepwalkers. Local physicians wrote in their private journals that Blackwood's skin had taken on a faint gray pallor, that his hair had stopped growing, and that his heartbeat, when it could be detected at all, was strangely slow, as if he were conserving something. And then there's the ledger from the apothecary, showing monthly deliveries of mercury, powdered hematite, and something only listed as resin A, shipped in heavy glass jars from Boston under false manifests. Each ingredient matches the chemical traces I found in samples from the hardened black veins of the vault's walls. Whatever that resin is, it's not inert. Its structure reacts to heat and moisture, becoming pliable, almost alive. Imagine it, the coffin sitting atop a platform designed to channel air through those veins, air thickened by that resin, carrying whatever substance Blackwood wanted in his lungs, or in his blood, forever. That's why the builders feared the exchange. It wasn't about preserving him as a monument. It was about keeping him active in a way that no one would dare call life, but no one could truthfully call death. And if that's true, then he's not just resting down there in the dark. He's waiting. The surviving accounts of the 1907 breach are rare, and most are written in fragments. Shaky sentences buried in the back pages of family Bibles, unsigned notes hidden in attic trunks, whole passages crossed out in thick black ink, as if the writer had changed their mind halfway through telling it. But when you piece them together, a picture forms, and it's the kind of picture that stains the mind. The men described stepping into air so cold it made their teeth ache, but so thick they felt as if they were breathing through cloth. Their lanterns didn't burn clean. The flames sputtered, bending toward the coffin as if pulled by an unseen draft. One man claimed the walls were warm to the touch, a slow pulse moving through the stone, as though something beneath it was alive and breathing. Another swore that when they pried the bolts loose, he heard a faint exhale from inside the coffin. Not a groan, not the creak of metal, but the sound of a man letting out a long, satisfied breath after holding it far too long. And then there was the smell. Not rot, not mildew, but something sharp and metallic, the way the air smells after lightning strikes. They said his eyes were closed at first, but as the torchlight swept over his face, they opened just a fraction. Pale, glassy, unfocused, yet unmistakably aware. That was when Jonas Harrow dropped his lantern and bolted for the hillside, screaming that, "It's looking for a name." None of them spoke to him again before he died. Jonas Harrow's dying words were dismissed as the ravings of a man broken by fear, but the pattern of what followed says otherwise. Within weeks of the crypt being opened, people in Blackwood Falls began to behave strangely, not erratically, but in subtle, almost imperceptible ways that only those closest to them would notice. They would forget the names of family members they had known all their lives. They would write letters, only to sign them with unfamiliar signatures. Shopkeepers began marking their ledgers with strange curling symbols instead of their usual names. The town's pastor, Reverend Coulter, began every sermon with the phrase, "He who is unnamed cannot die," a sentence that appears nowhere in Scripture. And then there were the dreams, hundreds of accounts collected quietly by the county coroner, each describing the same thing: a stone room, a book with translucent pages, and a voice asking a single question: "What shall I call you?" Those who tried to answer in the dream claimed they woke up unable to remember their own names for hours, sometimes days. The ones who resisted speaking at all would wake to find those spirals carved into the wood of their bed frames or scratched into the frost on their windows. It wasn't death Thomas Blackwood was reaching for. It was identity, a piece of the self that could be drawn out, held, and perhaps worn by something else. If the vault was a machine, then a name was the key it was built to harvest. The book wasn't born with Thomas Blackwood. It was older, much older, and its trail runs like a thin vein of poison through history. In 1796, a British naval officer named Captain Elias Durnford recorded seizing an unholy volume from a smuggler's chest off the coast of Newfoundland. His log describes it as bound in a hide too thin to be from cattle, yet too coarse for vellum, with pages fine as wasp wings that shimmered faintly in the dark. He never broke the binding, claiming the symbols on its cover shifted when the eye lingered too long. 2 months later, Durnford disappeared from his quarters at sea, leaving only his uniform folded on his bunk, and the book gone. 30 years later, the name Blackwood first appears in the ledgers of a Boston antiquities dealer known for acquiring artifacts with no legal provenance. What's more disturbing is that sketches of the book from those dealers' archives match the object described in the dreams of Blackwood Falls residents after 1907 down to the smallest detail. The spiraling border, the fractured circle stamped into its center, the strange way its pages seemed to ripple as though stirred by breath. That means whatever was in the crypt wasn't a possession Blackwood stumbled upon. It was something he sought, something he knew how to use. And perhaps that's why he ordered the vault built with its veins and resin, not just to preserve himself, but to preserve the book in a state where it could continue feeding. The chilling part? In every account of the book across the decades, it's never read from beginning to end. Every owner stopped or vanished before reaching the final page. Blackwood Falls was never meant to be just another frontier town. It was engineered, stone by stone, to serve the needs of whatever lay between the vault walls. The earliest land deeds from 1820, signed in Thomas Blackwood's precise, slanted hand, show that every building plot was sold with a restrictive covenant. No alterations to foundations without written approval from the town proprietor. On paper, it looked like a way to maintain order in the new settlement. In truth, it meant every cellar, every well, every sewer line was laid out according to a master plan only Blackwood possessed, a pattern that, when mapped from above, spirals inward like the symbols in the vault. Witnesses claimed that in the first year, Blackwood would host gatherings in the unfinished town square under the guise of civic meetings, reading from a pale, translucent-paged book by lantern light. People who attended swore they couldn't recall what was said, only that they left feeling as though their thoughts were sharper, more ordered, but not entirely their own. Within a year, there were no disputes over land or livestock, no drunken fights at the tavern, no public dissent at all. Not because the town was harmonious, but because no one seemed willing to speak against Blackwood in any capacity. In the 1822 census, nearly every resident's name was signed in their own hand, except for one peculiar detail. The signatures of 39 men and women were all in the exact same script. When a traveling magistrate questioned this, he was found dead the next morning on the road out of town, his name carved into the frost on his carriage window in curling spirals. From that day forward, no outsider ever questioned Blackwood's rule. By 1907, the spiral was no longer visible to the untrained eye. The dirt tracks had become paved streets, the wooden shacks replaced by brick and clapboard houses, and yet the geometry remained, buried beneath a century of development like a ghost imprint on the land. You can stand in the town square and not notice that every street curves ever so slightly inward, that no road leads straight out of town without first bending toward the cemetery hill. The alignment isn't accidental. At certain times of year, when the moon is low and the river swells, the spiral channels wind and water alike toward the vault. Some say it affects people the same way. There are newspaper reports from that year, subtle, almost innocent, of townsfolk waking up in unfamiliar parts of Blackwood Falls, having wandered in their sleep. They'd find themselves standing at street corners, staring at the cemetery gates, or pausing mid-step on the hill as if listening for something under the earth. And there's the testimony of Mary Conroy, the school teacher, who began marking her blackboard with curling spiral shapes during her lessons without realizing it. When a fellow teacher asked her why she drew them, she couldn't recall doing it at all. Patterns began to surface in the library's lending records, books on navigation, astronomy, and ancient scripts all checked out together by people who had never shown interest in such subjects before. It's as though the spiral is more than a street plan. It's a slow turning gear, drawing every thought, every footstep, every drop of life in Blackwood Falls toward the crypt. It started quietly. A man calling his wife by the wrong name, a shopkeeper signing receipts with letters that weren't in his own alphabet. But by autumn of 1907, the changes were impossible to dismiss. The people of Blackwood Falls were not just forgetting things, they were replacing them. Names, habits, even memories began to shift like silt in the river, settling into shapes that didn't belong to them. Children came home from school insisting their parents had other names, names their mothers and fathers swore they had never used in their lives. The postmaster began delivering letters with no return address, each one marked with curling spirals instead of stamps. And when questioned, he would grow glassy-eyed and say, "It's already been signed for." Several residents began avoiding mirrors entirely, claiming that when they looked into them, the reflection would hesitate a fraction of a second before moving. And in that moment, The mouth in the glass would shape a different name than the one they knew. Most chilling was the case of Daniel Keene, a blacksmith's apprentice, who one morning walked into the sheriff's office, placed his hammer on the desk, and declared, "Daniel is gone. My name is Thomas." Witnesses swore his voice was wrong, deeper, slower, and when asked Thomas who, he simply smiled, a thin, cold imitation of joy, and replied, "The one who waits." Sheriff Amos Harlan was not a man given to superstition, but by November of 1907, his ledger was thick with cases that had no sensible explanation. He had written down every incident, the names lost, the wrong signatures, the letters with no sender. But the more he read over them, the less they looked like isolated events, and the more they formed a pattern, curling across the pages like the spirals in the cemetery wall. Harlan began making quiet visits to those affected, asking them where they had been in the days before their slips. Again and again, the answers circled back to the same thing: a walk that led them past the old cemetery gates, or dreams that ended with them standing on the hill, looking down at a black iron door half buried in the earth. The sheriff's own unease deepened when one night, after working late, he awoke in his chair at the station with dirt under his fingernails and the taste of iron on his tongue, and a memory of pushing against something cold and metallic in the dark. He told no one, but the next day he ordered the blacksmith to forge a key from the description in an 1821 builder's log he had found in the town archives. The entry called it the inner seal key, and its measurements matched the rusted imprint still visible in the crypt's gate. Harlan kept the key hidden in his desk, telling himself it was only in case of emergency, but every night after, he would catch himself touching the drawer, feeling the weight of it in the dark, as though it were tugging him back toward the hill. It was the coldest night of the year when Sheriff Harlan finally gave in to the pull. The town slept under a crust of frozen snow, the moon dim behind gauzy clouds, and not a sound stirred but the crunch of his boots on the cemetery path. He carried no lantern, only the inner seal key in his coat pocket, its weight a steady heartbeat against his ribs. The cemetery gates opened without protest, as though expecting him, and he followed the winding rows of headstones until the hill sloped toward the black iron door, half swallowed by earth. Frost rimed its edges, but the key slid into the lock as if it had been waiting a century to feel its teeth again. The turn was smooth, almost too smooth, and as the bolt withdrew, there came a sigh from the other side, long and low, like a breath escaping from lungs that had been holding it since 1821. The door swung inward to reveal a narrow stone stair spiraling down into blackness, the air warm and faintly metallic. As Harlan descended, the walls closed in, their spiraled carvings catching the weak glint of moonlight that followed him only part way before being swallowed by the dark. At the bottom, the passage opened into the chamber, and there it was. The coffin, black iron etched with red inlays that seemed brighter than they should be, as if lit from within. The resin-filled veins in the walls glistened wetly, pulsing with a rhythm too slow to be human. And then, in the thick silence, he heard it. A voice, not aloud, but in the marrow of his bones, whispering his name, and asking him what it should call him instead. Harlan stepped toward the coffin, the red glow in its etchings pulsing in time with his own heartbeat, until he could no longer tell whether the rhythm was his or the thing inside. The air was so thick it felt like walking underwater, every breath coated with the metallic tang of the resin that seeped from the walls. He reached out, meaning only to brush the surface, but the moment his fingertips grazed the cold iron, the carvings shifted beneath his skin, curling into shapes that were not letters, yet still conveyed meaning. His meaning. Images bloomed in his mind, sharp and intrusive. His first day as sheriff, his mother's voice calling his name across a summer field, the face of the first man he ever arrested. Each memory flickered, then dissolved into spirals that wound inward until there was nothing left but the sound of a voice. The same voice Jonas Harrow had described, speaking his name again and again until it began to sound wrong, unfinished, hungry. His hand stuck fast to the metal as though the coffin were breathing through him, and for one terrifying instant he saw his own reflection in its surface. Not his face as it was, but hollow-eyed, lips drawn back in that same thin, knowing smile Thomas Blackwood had worn in death. With a shudder that broke the trance, he wrenched his hand free, stumbling back. The pulsing slowed, but the voice didn't stop. It followed him up the spiral stairs, whispering softly, as though patient, as though certain he would return. Harlan staggered out of the cemetery just before dawn, the frost crunching under his boots louder than it should have been, as though the world itself had gone too still. He didn't remember locking the crypt door, yet when he glanced back it was shut tight, the key cold and damp in his pocket. By the time he reached Main Street, the lamps were still burning, though no one had lit them, their flames curling in slow, deliberate spirals. Shop signs hung crooked, swaying without wind, and every pane of frost on every window bore the same looping pattern drawn from the inside. When he finally reached his office, the morning ledger lay open on his desk, a name written in a hand that wasn't his own. Thomas Blackwood. The ink was still wet. Within hours, reports began to trickle in from across town. People woke to find unfamiliar items in their homes, a blacksmith's hammer in a schoolteacher's bed, a child's shoe in the church bell tower, a book of ledgers in the flour bin of the bakery, all marked with curling symbols burned into the wood or leather. Several residents claimed they'd been called by the wrong name all day, not once or twice, but every time, by every person they spoke to. The shift was spreading, silent and methodical, like a tide rising in the dark. Harlan tried to write it off as coincidence, but each time he picked up his pen, his hand hesitated at the signature line, as if waiting for permission to write a name that wasn't his. By the end of that week, Harlan noticed something more unsettling than the names. The records themselves were changing. In the county archives, where he'd once read pages of birth registries, land deeds, and criminal reports, there were now blank spaces where names should have been, replaced by curling spirals in faint gray ink. Photographs in the Historical Society's collection, which had shown families standing proudly in front of their homesteads, now displayed gaps in the image. Empty spaces where people should have been, the background warped into the same spiral geometry as the town's layout. In the 1821 founding charter, which Harlan had studied only months earlier, Thomas Blackwood was no longer listed as the sole proprietor. Now the space beside his name held another, half legible in a script that seemed to pulse when stared at too long, as though alive. Even the sheriff's own journals betrayed him. Entries he remembered writing in his own hand now contained details he'd never seen before. Dates shifted by decades, deaths marked as voluntary, arrests replaced by words like collected and integrated. It was as if the exchange wasn't just taking identities from the living, but retrofitting them into the past, rewriting the story of the town from the inside out. The worst moment came when he found a photograph of the 1895 town council, a picture he'd seen many times, hanging in the courthouse. But now, between the mayor and the pastor, stood a tall man in a black coat whose face was gaunt, lips curled into that same thin, knowing smile. Beneath it, the caption read, Thomas Blackwood, Council Chair, 1895, present. By December, Harlan knew the town was slipping beyond recovery. Every day, more faces looked subtly wrong, smiles held too long, eyes that didn't blink enough, voices carrying that faint, unnatural cadence he'd first heard in the crypt. The idea of destroying the vault came to him not as a plan, but as a compulsion, rising in his mind like a memory that had been there all along. He told no one, but the secrecy didn't matter. They seemed to know. The blacksmith refused to sell him blasting powder, claiming it had been reserved for other work. The general store, which had never closed in his lifetime, locked its doors when they saw him coming. Even the church, where he'd gone for counsel, turned him away, the pastor smiling faintly as he said, "The vault keeps us whole, Sheriff. It keeps us named. That night, his own deputy, a man he'd trusted for 10 years, appeared in his doorway with a lantern, speaking in a voice too slow, too measured. "It doesn't want to hurt you, Amos. It only wants to know you." The deputy placed something on the desk, a small, black stone etched with a single spiral, and left without another word. When Harlan touched it, the same metallic taste flooded his mouth as in the crypt, and he realized with sick certainty that the exchange had already marked him. If he didn't act soon, he wouldn't just lose his name, he'd lose the memory that there had ever been a different one. Harlan waited until the longest night of the year, when the snow muffled every sound and the town lay buried under a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped turning. He'd scavenged what he could in secret. A satchel of kerosene siphoned from the train depot, a crowbar hidden beneath his coat, and the old Civil War revolver his father had kept locked away for decades. The inner seal key felt heavier now, almost warm against his chest, as if it could sense what he intended. He moved through the streets without a lantern, trusting the pale wash of moonlight on the snow, and every step felt watched, though no one stood in the windows or doorways. At the cemetery gates, he paused, listening, not for footsteps, but for the low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It was stronger now, vibrating up through the soles of his boots. The black iron door yielded easily to the key, swinging inward to release a rush of warm, metallic air. The spiral stairs seemed steeper than before, the carvings in the walls shifting subtly in the corner of his vision as though they were watching him descend. At the bottom, the chamber was brighter than he remembered, the coffin's red inlays glowing like embers, the resin veins in the walls pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. The voice was there too, calm, patient, closer now. And it didn't say his name this time. It said, "Come closer, Amos. You've brought yourself." Harlan didn't hesitate. The moment his boots hit the chamber floor, he yanked the satchel open and splashed kerosene across the coffin, the resin-filled veins, even the carved floor beneath him. The smell hit hard, sharp and oily, mixing with the metallic tang that already clung to the air. He struck a match, but before the flame could drop, the walls moved. Not in the way stone should shift, but in a slow, flexing ripple, the spirals bulging outward like muscle beneath skin. The resin veins pulsed faster, their black sheen turning slick as though sweating. The coffin's red inlays flared, and from inside came a sound. Not a voice this time, but a slow, deliberate breath in, as though something was drawing the air from the chamber, from him. His knees buckled under the sudden pressure, the match slipping from his fingers and snuffing out before it hit the ground. Then the spirals on the coffin began to rise in relief, curling like fingers reaching toward him. He swung the crowbar hard, the clang ringing through the vault. But where metal met iron, the coffin didn't dent. It shuddered, and the sound that followed was unmistakable. A heartbeat, slow and deep, echoing through the chamber. And then the voice came again, not whispering this time, but speaking with the calm certainty of someone already inside your head. "It is not the coffin you must open, Amos. It is you." The moment the crowbar struck, the voice sank deeper, curling into Harlan's thoughts like smoke through a crack, and the chamber began to fade around him. The walls, the coffin, even the faint red light dissolved, replaced by a warm summer field he hadn't seen since boyhood. Tall grass bending in the wind, his mother's voice calling him in for supper. For an instant he felt the sun on his face, smelled the bread baking, and then he noticed her hands. They were clasped in front of her, fingers too long, too many joints, curling into that same spiral shape carved into the vault walls. When she spoke again, her voice was wrong, lower, slower, weighted with something ancient. "Amos," she said, "you've already opened the door. Now all you need to do is step through." He turned, and the field was gone. replaced by the faces of every man, woman, and child in Blackwood Falls, standing in a tight circle around him, their mouths moving in unison, whispering his name over and over until the sound no longer belonged to him. He tried to back away but found himself pressed against the coffin, its surface warm now, the spirals still moving beneath his palms. In that moment, he realized the truth. It wasn't his death the vault wanted. It was his consent, the willing surrender of his name, so it could be worn by something else. Harlan's pulse roared in his ears, matching the slow, deliberate thud of the thing inside the coffin. Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The faces in the circle pressed closer, their eyes dark wells with faint spirals turning deep inside. The voice in his head shifted, no longer coaxing but commanding. Say it. He clenched his jaw, forcing his thoughts to cling to his own name, to the weight of it, to the sound of his father's voice speaking it in pride. The circle's whispering grew louder, overlapping, until it became a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle his teeth. His palms burned where they touched the coffin, the moving spirals digging into his skin like brands. With a ragged breath, he shouted his own name into the dark, forcing it past the pressure in his skull. The hum cut off instantly. The field, the faces, the warmth, all gone. He was back in the crypt, on his knees before the coffin, the crowbar beside him. The resin veins pulsed violently now, the glow in the inlays flickering like a dying heartbeat. The voice returned, quieter, but edged with something sharp, almost amused. Names are only the beginning. Then the walls heaved, dust raining from above, and Harlan knew the vault was not finished. It was angry. Harlan grabbed the crowbar and staggered toward the spiral stairs, but the vault moved faster. The walls flexed inward with a grinding groan, the spiral carvings twisting into deeper, sharper ridges, as though they were teeth closing around him. The resin veins pulsed like arteries under strain, their black surface splitting in places to reveal a slick red glow beneath, not light, but something alive. The air thickened, pressing against his chest until every breath felt stolen. Behind him, the coffin gave a slow, resonant knock. Once, twice, each sound sending vibrations through the floor. The staircase was already shrinking, the first steps warping and curling in on themselves, spirals tightening until they vanished into solid stone. The only way out was closing like the iris of an eye, and with every second the voice in his skull grew louder, overlapping itself in countless tones. Stay, stay, stay. His vision swam, the edges darkening, but his hands kept moving, prying at the warped stone with the crowbar, each strike answered by a deep, slow thud from the coffin, as if it were knocking back. The vault wasn't just trapping him, it was adjusting, reshaping itself to keep him here forever. The staircase was almost gone when Harlan realized there was only one move left. If he couldn't get out, he could make sure nothing else did either. His fingers fumbled at the satchel, pulling free the last of the kerosene, splashing it in wide arcs across the pulsing veins and the coffin itself. The resin hissed where the liquid touched, as though recoiling, but the walls pushed closer still, the spirals biting into the air between them. He struck a match, the flare bright and sharp in the choking gloom, and for a fraction of a second the vault froze. The heartbeat, the groan of the walls, even the voice in his head fell silent, as if stunned. Then, as the match dropped and the flames caught, the resin ignited with a sound like 1,000 inhalations at once. The glow spread in frantic veins up the walls, twisting through the spirals until the entire chamber blazed with a violent red light. The coffin shuddered, the inlays flaring so bright they left after-images in his eyes. A deep, furious roar, not human, not even fully sound, rolled through the vault, and cracks shot through the stone beneath his boots. He drove the crowbar into the warped stairs again and again, each blow rewarded with another inch of space, the flames licking closer to his hands as the vault seemed to writhe in pain, The flames tore through the chamber like they had been waiting for centuries to burn, each vein exploding into ribbons of molten resin that hissed and spat against the stone. The spirals on the walls convulsed, twisting tighter, shrinking in on themselves as if trying to strangle the fire. Overhead, slabs of granite groaned and shifted, dust raining down in choking clouds, and the coffin's glow flared to a blinding white before flickering erratically, like a heart on the verge of stopping. Harlan had made enough space in the warped staircase to climb, but every step upward came with the deep, pained thud of the coffin below. A sound that was no longer a heartbeat but a calling, summoning him back. His boots slipped on resin-slick stone, and when he looked down, the sight stopped him cold. The coffin's lid was no longer shut. A narrow seam had opened, and from within, two pale hands pressed slowly against the iron, fingers curling as if testing the air. The voice returned, quieter now, almost tender. "You can end the fire, Amos. Just give me your name." He knew he could go, force his way to the surface and leave the thing to burn, or turn back and end it completely, even if it meant never seeing the snow-covered streets above again. Harlan's breath came in ragged bursts, each one tasting of smoke and resin, his hands raw from gripping the jagged stone. The pale fingers on the coffin flexed again, curling into that same spiral shape, and he felt the pull in his chest, not physical, but deeper, like a hook set in the core of his mind. The voice was patient now, coaxing instead of commanding. "Let me take it, Amos, and you'll never be forgotten." For a moment he imagined it, stepping back down, pressing his palms to the warm iron, surrendering the weight of his own name in exchange for something older, more enduring. But then the image shifted, and he saw the town above. Children wandering in the snow without their memories, neighbors calling each other by names they didn't own, every life bent into the spiral until nothing human remained. His grip tightened on the crowbar. With a roar, he hurled himself back down the steps, slamming the iron bar into the coffin's seam again and again, sparks flying as the lid buckled. The hands withdrew, the voice rising in a furious howl that made the stone tremble. The flames surged higher, swallowing the spirals, and he drove the crowbar one final time until the lid crashed shut. The chamber shuddered violently, the ceiling cracking wide, and Harlan knew the only way out now was up, fast. The moment the coffin's lid slammed shut, the vault convulsed like a living thing in agony. The resin veins split wide, spilling molten black fluid that hissed and steamed on the stone floor, while the spirals in the walls twisted tighter, collapsing in on themselves until they were nothing but deep, jagged cracks. Harlan turned and climbed, every muscle screaming, his boots slipping on stone that shifted underfoot as though trying to throw him back down. The roar from below was no longer a voice, but a low, resonant vibration that shook his bones, following him upward, pressing against his spine like the breath of something vast and unseen. Chunks of granite the size of barrels crashed past him, shattering into shards that sliced his arms and face. Heat surged up the stairwell, the flames chasing him, licking at his coat. He could see the faint moonlight above, an opening no wider than a coffin lid, but it was closing, the warped doorway twisting into a spiral knot of stone. With a final burst of strength, he jammed the crowbar into the narrowing gap and pulled himself through just as the passage sealed shut behind him, the last sound from below a slow, deliberate knock, followed by silence. Harlan tumbled onto the frozen hillside, gulping the night air like a drowning man, the cold burning his lungs. Snow clung to his coat in blackened streaks where the molten resin had touched, and the crowbar in his hand was still warm enough to steam. For a moment, the silence felt absolute. No heartbeat from below, no whisper in his skull. But then he noticed the cemetery gates. They stood wide open, frost curling inward as though drawn toward the hill. Beyond them, The town lay under the same pale moonlight he had seen when he descended, yet something was wrong. The street lamps burned in a steady spiral pattern from the outskirts inward, each one casting light that seemed to bend toward the square. Figures moved in the distance, slowly, deliberately, their heads turning in unison to watch him. Even from here, he could see the faint glimmer of spirals in their eyes, as though whatever he had sealed below had left its mark above. When he took a step toward the gates, every figure froze, and in the still air, a single word drifted from 100 mouths at once, quiet but clear. "Amos." Harlan gritted his teeth and pushed forward, snow crunching under his boots as he stepped through the cemetery gates. The townsfolk didn't move, only turned their heads to follow him as he passed, their eyes unblinking, the spirals in their pupils faintly pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. He kept his gaze fixed on the square ahead, the crowbar gripped tight in his hand, but with every turn he took, the streets curved subtly inward, guiding him in arcs that brought him back to the same corners, the same lamp-posts, the same blank-faced watchers. The spiral was no longer just a pattern in the town's design. It was moving, tightening, forcing him into smaller and smaller loops. The lamps hummed faintly now, the same low vibration he had felt in the vault, and the snow beneath his boots carried that hum upward into his bones. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll, slow and deliberate, but each strike came seconds before the sound should have reached him, as if the town itself was speaking directly into his head. He turned one last corner and found himself back where he had started, at the cemetery gates. But now every figure that had been in the square stood before him, blocking the path, their breath curling into the cold air in perfect unison as they whispered again, "Amos." The truth struck Harlan, not as a thought, but as a physical weight settling into his chest. The spiral wasn't a trap to keep him in place. It was a design to bring him here. Every curved street, every watchful gaze, every step he'd taken since emerging from the vault had been part of a pattern laid long before he was born, and now he was standing in its center. The townsfolk closed in, moving without haste, their boots leaving marks in the snow that aligned perfectly into new rings around him, each one tightening like the coils of a snake. The church bell kept tolling, not counting the hour but matching the slow thud he had heard inside the coffin, and with every strike, the spiral of people shifted inward, the air between them humming in that low, resonant tone. Then he saw it. In the snow at his feet, a faint red glow pulsing upward from beneath the frozen ground, spreading outward in arcs that connected the townsfolk to one another like spokes on a wheel. The hum grew louder, and the glow climbed into their legs, their chests, their throats, until it gathered in their mouths. In perfect unison, they whispered his name one last time, and this time it didn't sound like a summons. It sounded like ownership. The last echo of his name hung in the air like frost suspended mid-breath, and then the snow beneath Harlan's boots cracked open in a perfect spiral. The ground didn't collapse so much as peel away, curling downward like a scroll revealing something written far beneath the surface. From the glowing fissure emerged the same black resin he had seen in the vault, molten and alive, threading upward in twisting veins that anchored themselves into the surrounding buildings. The hum became a roar, shaking every window in the square, as the resin columns pulled themselves higher, weaving together into a shape that was neither man nor beast, but something older, something that carried the architecture of the spiral in its very bones. In the molten glow of its form, Harlan saw fragments of faces, people he knew, people who had vanished, their features caught mid-expression like insects in amber. At its center, half swallowed by the resin, was the coffin he had tried to destroy, the red inlays pulsing like a heart, the lid shifting as if the thing inside was inhaling for the first time in a century. And through it all, the voice came not from the creature, not from the coffin, but from everywhere at once, deep and resonant. "The name is mine." Harlan knew there was no outrunning it now. The spiral had drawn him here for this moment, and whether he fought or yielded would decide nothing except how quickly he was taken. The resin columns loomed above him, the massive shape at their center unfolding in slow, deliberate motion, each movement pulling the air from his lungs as though the town itself was breathing through it. The faces embedded in its body turned toward him, mouths moving in silence, some pleading, some smiling with that same thin, knowing curve. The coffin at its heart shuddered with each pulse of red light, the seam widening to reveal a darkness deeper than the winter sky. The voice in his head was no longer a whisper or a command. It was a presence, pressing against every thought, every memory, until it felt like his own mind was an open door. He raised the crowbar, feeling the heat from the fissures lick at his hands, and with a ragged shout he charged straight into the spiral's center, swinging at the resin veins in wild, desperate arcs. Each strike tore loose a gout of molten black that hissed on the snow, but for every vein he severed, two more rose from the ground, wrapping around his legs, his chest, his arms, pulling him toward the open coffin, as the voice said with finality, "You've brought yourself." The tendrils coiled tighter, dragging Harlan toward the coffin with a strength that made his bones creak. He fought, every muscle straining, but the resin was no longer just a physical grip. It was inside him, threading through his thoughts, prying open his memories one by one. Flashes of his life flickered before his eyes, but they were wrong, bent into the spiral's shape. His father's voice speaking not his name, but Thomas, the badge on his chest etched with curling red lines, the town square always lit in the spiral pattern. The air grew heavier, until every breath he took felt like inhaling molten metal, and when he finally looked into the coffin, he saw not Blackwood's preserved corpse, but his own face, pale and still, lips pulled into that thin, knowing smile. The voice spoke again, quieter now, almost gentle. "One name, many bearers. You will not end. You will continue." The tendrils lifted him, lowering him toward the open coffin as the red light flared so bright it painted the snow in blood. In that final moment before the darkness took him, Harlan realized that the spiral hadn't been drawing him to destroy the vault at all. It had been leading him here to replace what had been lost. By the first thaw of spring, the snow had melted clean from the streets of Blackwood Falls, and the townsfolk went about their days as though nothing had happened. The spiral pattern of the street lamps remained, burning with a steady, unnatural glow each night, but no one seemed to notice. In the sheriff's office, the desk was orderly, the ledgers neatly stacked, and a new nameplate rested on the door. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood. He walked the streets in Harlan's body, wearing Harlan's coat, tipping his hat to shopkeepers who greeted him without hesitation. But in his eyes, faint and steady, the red spiral turned. The cemetery hill was sealed again, the ground undisturbed, though on quiet nights, those who lived closest swore they could hear the slow, deliberate thud of a heartbeat beneath the earth. Children born long after the flood of 1907 would sometimes pause mid-game in the square, tilt their heads as if listening, and murmur a name their parents didn't recognize. And in the archives the old record shifted once more. Where once there had been a list of sheriffs spanning the decades, there was now only one, his tenure stretching back to the founding of the town, unbroken, unaging, the ink beneath the glass case still fresh.